The first place I lived in after moving out of my parents' house was this tiny, dingy apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was affordable, and it was mine. Because the rent was so cheap, there were quite a few students from the nearby community college living there. Most of us were friendly with each other, and we'd hang out sometimes. But there was one guy who just killed the vibe whenever he was around. I don't think any of us knew his name or even really managed to have a conversation with him. We all mentioned seeing him linger in the laundry room, despite him wearing the same set of clothes every single day. Most of us wrote him off as the token creep of the neighborhood. This is just what you get for trying to save on rent. After all, he wasn't the only downside to that particular apartment complex. The walls were pretty much paper thin. I could usually hear just about everything go on in my neighboring apartments. That being said, I still didn't mind. My next-door neighbor was this really attractive girl from the community college. Of course, I always hoped that being so close to her meant that we'd eventually run into each other and maybe hit it off, but I didn't actually see much of her. Unfortunately, it was almost like she was trying to avoid being seen, as she would run out of her door and slam it in the middle of the night all the time. But since the walls were so thin, I could hear most of what she was like without meeting her. She was on her phone a lot, talking really loud to someone on the other side. Every once in a while, she'd have a friend over for the night and I'd lose some sleep. But otherwise, she seemed like a nice person to me. There was one night, though, where things seemed off. It was a Sunday night and I'd fallen asleep quite heavily after hanging out with my friends for a few hours. I woke up in the dead of night to the sounds of shouting and screaming coming through the wall from inside her apartment.
Get out! You're ugly! Like I'd ever... Ah!
It sounded like a heated argument, which was weird. I'd never heard my neighbor fight before. I could tell someone else was in the apartment. They were talking back. Come on, please! I shrugged it off and rolled over in my bed, thinking he was some lackluster playboy getting burnt and butted out. It was none of my business, and I didn't have the energy to do anything about it, so I went back to sleep. But the next morning, I woke up worried. For some reason, I had a sinking feeling about my neighbor. I stepped outside of my apartment and knocked on her door. Hello? There was no answer. I knocked a few more times, but still, nothing on the other side. I sighed in frustration and stepped back. We were on the second floor breezeway, so I leaned up against the railing and looked around the parking lot for her car. The parking spots were assigned in the same order as the apartments, so her car would be right next to mine. Her car is here. I thought I heard the door open, but when I turned back, it wasn't her who answered. The door to the other apartment next to hers was ajar, and the eyes of the neighborhood creep were staring at me. Can I help you? What's the deal with all the knocking? I had no idea he even lived in that unit until then. I never saw him enter or exit once in the months I'd been there. Slowly, I walked up to his doorway, but he continued to hide behind his door. Hey, have you seen your neighbor? Who? The girl, man. You know who I'm talking about. Oh, the girl. Her name was Lily. He scowled at me like I offended him, but I was confused. How did he know her name and I didn't? Oh, wait, man. What do you mean her name was Lily? I don't know. You don't know? Whatever. Look, I'm worried about her. I heard some crazy stuff from her place last night, and she's not answering her door. Have you seen her recently? I don't know. You don't know if you've seen her recently? Dude, I know your walls are just as thin as mine. I know you heard something weird last night, too. Come on, you heard it, didn't you? I don't know. All of a sudden, I realized just how crazy tense the creep had become. He still held the door half closed with white knuckles, sweat dripping down his forehead. He was no longer actually saying anything. but he never broke eye contact with me for a moment. Hey, I don't want to freak you out. I'm sorry. Why don't we just sit down inside and talk about this? It's early. No! The creep slammed the door shut with surprising strength, and right on my finger. Ah! 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 Oh, that bastard! I reeled back and reluctantly looked at my hand. Yeah, we'll say that finger was definitely broken. One more thing about cheap rent. You get cheap locks. In the rush of shock and anger, the sight of my gnarly finger broke me. I kicked the creep's door as hard as I could, channeling all the pain into it. I really didn't expect it to happen, but the creep's door flew open with a burst of splinters and a wimpy scream from the creep himself. But that didn't matter when I caught a glimpse through his doorway and into his living room. I saw just where my good neighbor had gone. She was chopped up into several pieces, arranged on the floor as part of some ritual involving drawings in her blood, and a lot of her dirty laundry, which I assume he stole. Dozens of bloody bras were strung around his room, along with several clumps of Lily's ginger hair, some pieces with scalps still attached to it. The sight was unbearable. I'd seen enough for a morning. I didn't want to fight a guy who chops up bodies, or be his neighbor, for that matter. It was a terrible tragedy what happened to that girl, and I feel stupid and guilty to this day, knowing that I might have been able to do something about it, but didn't even try. I didn't stay for long. Right after I got off the phone with the police, I called my landlord and broke my lease. I couldn't believe I was able to sleep through the murder of my neighbor. All I can say is, this is the last time I will ever rent out a cheap room, because you truly get what you pay for.
I mean, we just don't know where she is.
What about the parking lot area? I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there.
Body?
They took out a body there earlier. We don't know if it's the same person or not. Are you okay, sir?
I think I need to sit down.
Who in that complex do I need to talk to?
I don't know.
Tell me. I want to know.
I don't know where she is.
Why is there blood in your bathroom?
I don't know.
Yes, you do know. Why, Steven? Who did it?
I don't know.
This is a deadly tale that would leave one shook to their very core. What makes things worse was how I had to experience it and live to tell about it. The depictions of what transpired are very disturbing, and to what some would refer to as inhumane. I still don't understand why things happened the way they did. All I know is that I am truly scarred for the rest of my life. It all started when I was in my late 20s. I was currently living with my parents and had saved up a considerable amount financially. Of course, being in my late 20s, I desperately wanted to move out, so I began looking for some real estate agents to help search for an affordable house. After a month or two of heavy searching, I found a local agent who had a decent amount of experience. I remember he was showcasing a house for sale that was about an hour away from my parents' place. My agent ended up scheduling an open house appointment so that I could take a house tour to see if I was interested. When that day finally arrived, my agent and my dad and I drove to the destination on a Sunday afternoon. On our way there, I recall seeing dozens of farms, farm animals, and farmers. This part of town was obviously where the countryside was, so it was quite the drastic change compared to the city life I was used to. When we arrived there, I remember seeing a decent-sized home with a for sale sign on the lawn. At first glance, the house looked pretty decent. I could honestly tell that whoever lived in that house knew how to keep their home pretty well kept. As we made our way onto the front porch, we got greeted by a middle-aged couple. The man introduces himself and his wife as Joe and Sally. My agent introduces my dad and I respectively as we all began making our way inside the house. I recall the house not being too big but relatively decent size. It consisted of 2 floors with 2 bedrooms and 1 washroom. To be honest, I was already sold on the place. The house met all my needs and seemed to be in pretty pristine condition. I expressed my intentions with the homeowners and could visibly see how excited the couple got. I assumed they were excited to move out and wanted to get rid of the burden of having the house on sale. We then proceeded to make our way out of the house, and from the corner of my eye, I saw the couple looking at the ceiling with their hands clasped together, chanting a prayer. I found it a bit alarming, but shrugged the notion off, assuming they were just really religious. After a week of consulting with my agent and parents, I concluded with the decision of proceeding with the purchase. The house was being sold at a surprisingly low price, which obviously fit within my budget. I ended up signing all the paperwork and put a down payment on the house. During my first day of moving in, my dad and older cousin helped me move some furniture into my new home. I recall seeing my new neighbor standing outside his front porch. He looked like an older gentleman that was roughly within his late 40s. We both made eye contact and I saw him politely waving at me. I then waved back at him and said, "Hey, you must be my new neighbor." "Indeed. My name is Sebastian, but you can call me Bash for short." "Okay, nice to meet you, Bash. I'm Jack. Do you require any help moving your belongings in?" "No, it's fine, I think." "Nonsense! Let me give you a hand." Sebastian then inserts himself within my parameters and casually introduces himself to my dad and cousin. Throughout the rest of the day, we successfully moved our belongings within the household and share a few laughs with Sebastian. Despite the initial odd introduction, he turned out to be a pretty laid-back kind of guy. We all even shared a beer or two as the night was pretty swell to say the least. At around 11 p.m., my dad and cousin finally left the house, leaving Sebastian and I alone. I noticed Sebastian staring at a painting of Mona Lisa in my living room. The painting was a gift from the previous owners, so seeing him stare at it so intently was quite the scene to see. That's when I asked, "Hey, big fan of paintings, are you?" "Yes, Mona Lisa is one beautiful woman, isn't she?" Yeah. I'm the one who painted this." "Oh, really now?" "Yes. I actually gave it to the owners before you came here as a welcome to the neighborhood gift. I suppose they passed the gift to you now, huh?" "Yeah, they did. Well, if you painted this, then you are very talented, sir." "May I tell you something, Jack?" Sure, man." "I used to live in this house for decades, long before the previous owners did." I found Sebastian's statement a bit strange, seeing as he lived next door, so I said, "So why did you move from this house to next door?" "Well, my daughter ran away from home not too long ago. However, I've always wanted a bigger living space. I figured if I stayed in the area, she might come back home one day. That's why I moved next door. It also has 2 extra rooms in this house, so yeah." "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, sir. I hope she shows back one day." "And I also moved out because the house might be haunted." "What?" "I'm just kidding, Jack. Anyway, I'll see you around." "Okay, see you later, Bash." As Sebastian heads out the front door, I couldn't help but feel a sense of paranoia from the whole haunted remark. And why the hell he would joke about such a sensitive topic regarding his daughter. Even though he said he was joking, I couldn't tell if he was bluffing or just trying to cover up the fact that the place was actually haunted. Nonetheless, I knew that when we inevitably crossed paths again, I would double down and address the bizarre remark. After about a week in the new house, I could honestly say that living there was swell, except my paranoia grew stronger as the days went by. I couldn't help but stutter every time I heard the floor creak or the wind howling from outside my window, as I attributed it to Sebastian's haunted remark. The employees at my workplace even noticed how drowsy I was every time I showed up to work. I had lost a considerable amount of sleep every day. I couldn't help but feel a little frustrated considering I hadn't seen Sebastian since the day I moved in. It was almost as if he had isolated himself in his house or had completely relocated somewhere else. It was hard to track his whereabouts as I didn't know if his vehicle was in his garage or not. This is when the story gets extremely disturbing. There was one night when I remember tossing and turning in my bed from the nonstop creaks and sounds coming from my house. I decided to get up from my bed and cautiously walk towards my bedroom door. I could hear subtle sounds coming from downstairs. It didn't sound like the typical creaking sounds I usually heard, just a subtle male voice mumbling some kind of gibberish. I made sure to tiptoe my way towards the top of the staircase. As I began making my way towards the bottom of the stairs, I attempted to not make any sounds with each gradual step I took. The mumbling sound began to intensify. Someone was definitely down there. I eventually make it halfway through the staircase and saw Sebastian standing in my living room facing the Mona Lisa painting. My first instinct was to yell, "Get the hell out of here, I'm calling the cops," but I didn't want to potentially compromise my life, so I remained crouched down with my hand over my mouth. I couldn't help but feel emotions of anger and disgust as I asked myself, why the hell is this guy in my house in the middle of the night? How the hell did he get inside? Was he the one causing the creaking sounds this whole time? Panic began rushing through my veins when I could make out some of the words he was saying. "You're in a better place now, baby girl. Daddy still loves you, okay? You were the best girl a father could ever ask for. I loved every single moment we shared. I hope you can forgive me for what I did. Just know, Daddy did what he had to do, so he wouldn't go to jail. See you in the next life, baby girl. Sleep tight." Sebastian then casually walks away as I hear him exit through the back door and lock it upon his exit. I knew he must have had a spare key to the house. I made sure to keep the lights off as I didn't want to give Sebastian any indication that I had awoken. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator then said,
911, what's your emergency?
"Someone just broke into my house. I think it's my neighbor."
Okay, sir, please remain on the line. We're sending a unit your way.
"Well, hurry up, he might come back."
Sir, can you please confirm your address?
That's when I placed my phone on the floor and approached one of my closets that held some outdoor equipment.
Sir, are you still there?
I grabbed an axe and a hard hat with a flashlight attached to it and began walking towards the Mona Lisa portrait. I put the hard hat on and turned on the flashlight attached to it. Now, I'm not sure what possessed me to do this, but the portrait fueled my anxiety to the point where I completely yanked it off the wall and tossed it into the corner. My speculations were accurate. There behind the painting lied a patched up component to the wall. I could tell there must have been a hole previous to the patch, considering the color of it was different compared to the rest of the interior. That's when I raised my axe and began hacking at the wall like a maniac. At this point, all I could see was red. I completely obliterated the wall with every bad intention I had built up that night. The more destruction I caused, the more shocking secrets began unveiling themselves. There behind the wall lied the rotting corpse of a young girl. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was living with a dead corpse in my wall the whole time. Sirens from police cars began roaming the streets. Blue and red headlights flashed through my window and into my house. I rushed to my front door and began waving my arms profusely. After disclosing the details of the newly discovered corpse and the appearance of my neighbor in my house, the police began knocking repeatedly at his door as they couldn't barge in without a search warrant. About several minutes later, a loud bang could be heard within his house. It was later found out that Sebastian had pulled the gun on himself and completely blew his brains out. The corpse that was discovered in my house was indeed his daughter. Before I or any of the previous tenants had moved in, Sebastian had claimed that his daughter was a runaway. But the truth was, Sebastian had abused his daughter for years and eventually killed her. He hid her deceased body in the wall and patched it up before finally putting the house up for sale. Sebastian would use a famous portrait of Mona Lisa as a cover-up gift for new tenants. Some speculate that he moved next door because he wanted to further abuse the spirit of his daughter. I believe it was because the spirit of his daughter tormented him every night, the same way she did to me.
Over 10 years ago now, my parents and I moved into a duplex. It wasn't ideal for a family, but it was what we could afford after the housing crisis. although I was too young to understand that at the time. Most of our neighbors were friendly. The weekend after we moved in, several of them came over for a night of housewarming to welcome the new residents to the neighborhood and that sort of thing. It was getting late by the time they all arrived. My parents told me I was up too far past my bedtime and sent me to my room for the night. That bedroom shared a wall with the living room in which my parents and all the guests were talking. Since I wasn't given much of a choice, I decided to listen in on what the adults were saying. I could hear most of it, but I didn't understand very much. Though, there was one thing I did catch. They talked a lot about our next-door neighbor in the house connected to ours. He used to be a nice guy, but ever since his wife divorced him, he's gone down the deep end. He keeps to himself these days, but I keep an eye out for him. I'll try, but I haven't seen him since we moved in. What's he got behind those hedges, anyway? He gardens. It's all he cares about anymore. He and his wife used to plant all sorts of stuff. She's not around anymore, but I guess he keeps the tradition going. For some reason, the mention of our next-door neighbor gave me the chills. We'd been there for a few days, but I hadn't seen him once. Even to a kid, it was unsettling. I decided to stop eavesdropping and go to sleep. That would be one of the last times I ever got a good night's rest. A few nights later, I was running up and down the stairs when I noticed that we had a window halfway up the stairwell that looked out onto the backyard. I stopped to examine our neighbor's side of the backyard, which he had put up a fence to keep separated from our half. He even planted a 10-foot hedge behind the fence for added scenery, but I could see it all from the stairs. His half of the yard was overgrown with rows of thriving bushes and flowers, with a greenhouse in the far corner. I couldn't see through the glass, though. The inside was thick with vines. As I was watching, I finally saw the neighbor appear from within the greenhouse. He was filthy and fidgeted incessantly. He looked around as if to see if anyone was spying on him, then limped hurriedly into his house. I knew he was up to something fishy. My curiosity had been building since we moved in, and it got the best of me in that moment. I snuck past my parents and went out into the backyard. It was a full moon. While I knew he was still inside, I climbed over the fence and dropped in behind the hedge. I immediately regretted my boneheaded decision, as I was now stuck between the splinters of the fence and the thorns of the thickest hedge I'd ever seen. But I didn't have time to climb back up. The man busted open the back door and barreled outside. I stood motionless and spied him from the shadows as he came back to the greenhouse. This time, he was completely cleaned and dressed in a three-piece suit. He stood before the greenhouse door and straightened his tie, as if he was trying to calm his nerves. I miss you, Martha, but you've made your decision. I will keep our memory alive in the sanctuary of life and greenery. Life that you will nourish and support with your own flesh. The children we planted together are so grateful that you've come back to stay with us. Suddenly, he yanked open the door and went into the greenhouse. He barricaded himself inside for several minutes, and the whole time he was screaming softly and giggling with excitement like a little kid at a sleepover. But in between his clown sounds, I heard sawing and jangling chains. After a while, he stumbled out, panting and filthy again. Under the light of the full moon, I could see that he was not caked with dirt, but with blood. In terror, I watched him slink back into his house to wash up once more. I was mortified, but I had to see what he was doing in there, because it was definitely not gardening. I mustered up the courage to crawl through the bramble of the hedge and sneak up to the greenhouse. I gripped the latch, pulled back the door, and peeked in. An old woman was strung up by the hands and feet. Her back was cut open, exposing her lungs and spine. Her ribs severed and flayed out like wings. That image, I see it every time I blink, but I couldn't look away. As I stared, I saw something even worse. Her lungs, they were still breathing, rising and falling before my eyes. I ran away and jumped the fence like an Olympian. At that point, I gave up on being a junior investigator and handed it off to my parents and the police. But no matter what I try to do, even after all these years later, I can't unsee what I saw.